What's up? In this tutorial I'm gonna show you how to add player name tags above the head. So a little info before you're starting. For this tutorial I'm using these two tutorials as a base, but it's not necessary to have them. It's basically hosting and joining a server, so you can use your setup for that. Okay, let's begin with the first step, so the player can determine its own player name. First of all, go to your project settings and under maps and modes, here in a game instance, check what game instance you have here. If you have only game instance, that means that's the default one and you need to create a new one. If you have another one here, then browse to it and open it. But if you don't have one, you can actually create a game instance and then you can use that. But I'm using here this one. Also, if you create one, make sure to select it afterwards so it's active. So I'm opening here my active game instance, and in here I'm creating a new variable and call it player name, changing the type to text. You can compile it, then you can also add a default one, so if it's empty then it will take at least the default one, and we can close it. Now I have different options how the player can actually set this variable, set the value, set the player name. For this tutorial I'm doing that in a main menu widget that I have. You don't need to have exactly this widget, so that's just a widget that is showing up when you start playing. And here I'm adding a editable text box, so the player is able to enter something in there. I'm not starting that too much, only making it a bit bigger. And here I'm taking on text changed, so every time the player text changes in there, it should update the text in the game instance. So get game instance, now cast to your custom game instance, not cast here to game instance in general, cast to your game instance. And here I'm setting the player name, this variable, connecting it here. If you don't want that the player is able to enter it on its own, but instead maybe you have Steam integrated in your project and you want to take automatically the Steam name, you can also go here on event begin play or event construct. You can get the player name, get the player controller first, and from there you can get the player name. But for that you also need the advanced session plugin. So if you're running your game with Steam, I can also take this to then set the player name variable in your game instance and automatically on begin play taking this Steam name for your name. But for this tutorial I'm going this way, that the player can enter the player name on its own. Next step would be to go to the character that should have the name tag, and in this character I'm going to the viewport and adding a new widget component, taking normal widget and I'm moving that above the head. That now need a widget class that we now need to create a widget that should be our name tag then. So create here a user interface, widget blueprint, user widget, call it wb underscore player name tag. Open this, and in here I'm adding a border and removing it, making it transparent here for the brush color, and adding a new text in the border, also setting the screen size to desired. And I added the border so I'm able to make the text block here aligning to the center. Make sure, maybe you can also style it a bit. So maybe adding a bit of outline here. And next, you need to set this text block to be a variable. So tick this one here. Now we need one simple function in here. So create a new function. I call it set player name. Getting the text block and just set text. Then connect this pin here with the function, like so. It's already enough for this widget. Now I can go back to the character, and in this widget component here, we can now select the widget class, player name tag. Now you can see it here, it's really big, but we can scale it down. And also it makes sense to scale it down here because then also the resolution looks better. Next, maybe we can rename this here to player name tag widget. And then we can go to the event graph where we can, if you don't have an event begin play, you can add a new one. Otherwise, you can just use your event begin play that you have and make sure that this event begin play is calling a function. I'm calling that setup local, and I'm calling this one here on event begin play, because once a character is loading up, it's triggering the event begin play for all players. But we want that the this function here is only doing stuff locally on the owning player, on the player that controls this character. So I'm adding here a branch locally controlled. So the local player that is controlling this character should at the beginning get the game instance and cast to your custom game instance on true. Then should get the player name, so actually reading out the player name that the player entered at the beginning in the main menu. And now it's loading the player name locally, and it should now tell the server what the player name is. So the server can then tell all other players what the player name is. So to call it on the server, we need a new custom event in the event graph. Adding a custom event and call it set player name on server. Make sure that this is set to run on server and also to reliable true. And now we need a new variable, call it custom player name, and changing this to text. Now we can call this here, connect it, and also click again on this variable, and under replication, make sure to set this to rep notify. Once you set this to rep notify, you should see here a new function is created automatically, or a rep notify function. And what that means is once the server is changing the value of this variable, it will trigger this function for all other players. So all other players get notified if for them the value is changing. So by default, obviously this value here, once we compile, is empty. This text here is empty. What now happens is the local player that controls this character is getting the player name and then set player name on server. So the local player is getting the player name from its own game instance, then notifying the server to update this, to update the variable here, the player name, and then the value is changing here and it's getting triggered on all players. And now the players have now a new value here, and then we can get here the player name tag widget component, get the widget, and cast to the widget class we applied to it, which is here WB player name tag. Can connect it here and executing in there the set player name function. And we can connect this here. Okay. That actually should work already. Not completely, but I show you how it works at the moment. So if I start playing, left, I'm creating here a new player, call it player1, created. Now I see here, it says here, player1 above the head. Go here with player2, finding a session. And now the player joins the map and sees above its own head player2, which is fine. And also this player sees here player2, which is also fine. But what you're noticing now, this player that just joined does not say the other name tag correctly. And that has the reason that when this player here, this player2 was joining, it was loading up the other character. And it was loading the variable of the player name too fast. So this player2 actually knows that the other player is called player1, but then it failed because the widget component was not completely set up. Yeah, and then it failed. So really short delay after that, like probably 1 frame later, the widget would have been set up correctly, and then it would also be able to update the widget there, calling the function in the widget. But it was not completely loaded. And to fix that, you can go here in the web notify function and checking here if this, because this widget component at itself is already loaded up correctly and it is valid, but the get widget here, this is not valid. So we're checking here with an is valid, connecting it here, like so. And if it's not valid, so the case we had, where the case we just had, it would go here on is not valid. And here I'm going to here I'm going to set a timer by function name. And after a really short amount or a really short delay, I want to just call this function again. So then after 0.1 seconds, it probably should have loaded this completely, and then it can also set the player name. And the function name here should be exactly this one. So I'm just copying this here, pasting it in here. So for some reason, if there's a lag and it's not completely set up after 0.1 seconds, then it will go again and again until it's here valid. And to make it perfect, we can go here to the widget and say it is hidden in game. So only after it's completely loaded the widget, then we can unhide the widget component. Okay. Now probably you also want that the own player, because the own player knows its own name, doesn't want to see its own name tag. So we can go here to the widget component and can type here for owner no see. So owning players then no longer see its own widget. And what you probably also want is that the widget is facing always, the name tag is facing always the own camera. To do that, you need an event tick. If you have one, you can also again reuse it, but we're creating again a new function, and I call it now tick not local. So just make sure that this function is called on event tick. Why did I call it not local? Because we just made the player name tag invisible for the local player, so it's not necessary to calculate the widget rotation for the local player. And here we again adding a new branch and making here is locally controlled, connecting it here, and on here we're not going now on true, we're going on false because not local. So not on the owning player, but on all other players, the name tag should face their cameras. So we're getting here the player name tag widget, saying here set world rotation. Connecting this with false, important. And from this get name tag, from this name tag widget, we want to get world location. So with that, it's getting the actual world location of the widget of this character. And now for all players who execute this function here, they also need to get their own camera. For that, search here for get player camera manager and get then the actor location. So that's here the world location of this specific widget name tag in this character, and this here is then returning the world location of the camera of the other players. So another player sees this character and this is its own world location from the camera. Going here with the find look at rotation, connecting this and using that for the name tag. And now let's make a final test if everything works. Going here again with player 1, creating the session. Now it's good. The player cannot see its own player name. We're going here with the other player, going player 2, joining in here. And player 2 can now correctly see that the other player is called player 1. Player 1 can see that the other player is called player 2, so everything works as it should be. And I hope this tutorial was helpful for you. See you on the next one.